Fred Thomas had spent years cracking the toughest safes, but nothing in his life prepared him for the call that would shatter his world. One night, one accident, and one mystery would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family. What secrets would he uncover? Fred Thomas had always lived by the creed of precision and patience. At 42, he was a seasoned locksmith, renowned for his uncanny ability to crack even the most intricate safes. The click of tumblers and the whir of gears were the sounds of his craft, but beyond his workshop, Fred cherished his family more than anything. His wife, Mary, 39, was his partner in every sense, and their two children, Emily, 10, and Jason, 8, brought light to his world with their laughter and curiosity. That Thursday evening had been like any other, or so it seemed. Fred was at his workstation, deeply focused on a challenging vault restoration, when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, thinking it was another late-night client. But something about the persistent vibration compelled him to answer. "This is the sheriff's dispatcher," the voice said, breaking the mundane quiet of the night. Fred's heart skipped. "Your wife and children have been in an accident." The words hit him like a sledgehammer. Fred froze, the weight of those words sinking in. The dispatcher continued, her tone steady but devoid of reassurance. It was a hit and run. "Your wife, Mary, has been airlifted to Bauer Regional Medical Center. Her condition is unknown." Fred's mind raced. His tools clattered to the ground as he grabbed his keys and bolted for the door, every second feeling like an eternity. The drive to the hospital was a storm of emotions Fred couldn't control. He sped down the highway, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Questions swirled in his mind, each more haunting than the last. Was Mary alive? Were Emily and Jason okay? Why hadn't the driver stopped? The thought of his children's small, vulnerable bodies and Mary's soft smile kept flashing in his mind. He replayed the last time he'd seen them. Mary had kissed him goodbye as she took the kids to Emily's dance recital. Jason had been excited about stopping for ice cream afterward. It was all so ordinary, so safe until now. Fred's gut twisted with fear. He cursed the unknown and prayed for their safety in the same breath. The dispatcher's words echoed her condition as unknown, unknown. That single word clawed at his sanity. He had spent years solving puzzles and breaking through steel, but this was a mystery he wasn't sure he could endure. When the hospital finally came into view, Fred felt a flicker of hope. But it was quickly drowned by the sinking realization that the answers waiting inside might shatter his world forever. Fred arrived at the hospital, skidding into the parking lot with the screech of tires. He sprinted toward the main entrance, his heart pounding with desperation. The glass doors parted with a cold hiss, revealing the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room. But as Fred rushed forward, a burly security guard stepped in his path, raising a hand to stop him. "Visiting hours are over," the guard said flatly, his voice devoid of empathy. Fred's chest tightened. "My wife and kids were in a car accident. They're here. I need to see them," he pleaded, his voice trembling with urgency. "I'm sorry, sir. Rules are rules." The sheer indifference stoked a fire inside Fred. His hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to lash out. "Rules? My family could be dying in there," he barked, his voice echoing through the sterile hallway. Heads turned, but the guard remained unmoved. Just as Fred thought he'd lose the battle to rage and panic, a voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" A nurse, with kind eyes and a calming presence, approached the scene. She glanced at Fred, her expression softening as she listened to his desperate explanation. "It's okay," she said to the guard. "Let him through." Fred muttered a rushed thank you before following the nurse through the winding corridors. Each step felt heavier as he neared the truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The nurse led Fred to a quiet waiting room, where a doctor soon joined him. The man's face was weary, etched with the strain of too many late nights. Fred braced himself. "Mr. Thomas, your wife Mary is stable but unconscious," the doctor began. "She has minor physical injuries, a few cuts and bruises, but we're concerned about her lack of responsiveness. She hasn't woken up since the accident." Fred's breath hitched. "And my kids?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily has a fractured arm, and Jason has some bruises, but both are stable, the doctor reassured him. Relief washed over Fred momentarily, but his focus snapped back to Mary. Why isn't she waking up? Is there something else wrong? The doctor hesitated, glancing at the clipboard in his hands. We're running tests to determine the cause. Sometimes, trauma can have effects that aren't immediately visible. Fred was led to Mary's room, where the sight of her lying motionless hit him like a punch to the gut. Machines beeped steadily around her, and her face was pale, almost unrecognizable. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his, whispering, "I'm here, Mary. I won't leave you." As he sat there, his eyes traced over her injuries. That's when he noticed something strange: bruises on her arms and a faint, almost hidden mark on her neck. They didn't look like injuries from a car accident. A chill crept over him, and a single, haunting thought formed in his mind: what if this wasn't just an accident? Fred couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Sitting in the dimly lit hospital room, he studied Mary's still form. The bruises on her arms were dark and oddly shaped, more like fingerprints than the chaotic impact marks from a car accident. The faint mark on her neck appeared deliberate, almost like someone had gripped her tightly. A cold sense of dread crept into his chest. He leaned closer, gently brushing back Mary's hair, searching for more clues. His years as a locksmith had trained him to notice what others missed. Every scratch, dent, or mark told a story, and the story these injuries told wasn't adding up. Fred flagged down a nurse, his voice calm but urgent. "I need you to run more tests on her," he said, trying to keep his rising anxiety in check. The nurse hesitated. "Sir, we're focusing on stabilizing her condition right now. She's in a fragile state." "I understand," Fred said, his tone firmer now. "But look at these marks." He pointed to the bruises and the faint line on her neck. "These aren't from the accident. Something else happened to her." The nurse frowned, taking a closer look. "What kind of tests are you asking for?" Fred took a deep breath. "A rape kit. And a pregnancy test." The words felt heavy as they left his mouth, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion. The nurse's expression softened, a mixture of sympathy and unease. "I'll talk to the doctor," she said quietly before walking away. Fred sat back down, his hands trembling. The thought that someone could have hurt Mary in such a vile way made his blood boil. He had always prided himself on protecting his family, but now, sitting helplessly in a sterile hospital room, he felt powerless. Fred's thoughts were interrupted when two police deputies entered the room. Their uniforms were crisp, but their faces carried the weariness of a long night. "Mr. Thomas," one of them said, nodding in acknowledgement. "We wanted to update you on the situation." Fred stood, his jaw tight. "Tell me everything." The deputy glanced at his notes. "Your wife's vehicle was struck by a black SUV traveling at high speed. It was a hit and run, and the vehicle didn't stop. We found surveillance footage from a nearby intersection, and we're working to identify the driver." Fred's mind churned. "Was it an accident?" he asked, his voice low but intense. The deputies exchanged a brief glance. "At this point, we have no reason to believe otherwise," the other officer said. "But we're investigating all possibilities." Fred didn't miss the hesitation in their voices. They weren't telling him everything, they were holding something back. "What aren't you saying?" he pressed. The first deputy cleared his throat. "We'll know more once we've reviewed the footage and spoken to potential witnesses. Right now, we're treating it as a case of reckless driving." Fred clenched his fists. Reckless driving? That didn't explain the bruises on Mary's arms or the mark on her neck. Something about this felt deliberate, calculated. As the deputies left, Fred's unease deepened. He stared at Mary, his mind swirling with questions. What if the driver hadn't just been reckless? What if the accident was meant to hide something far more sinister? Fred sat alone in Mary's hospital room, the weight of the night pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. His instincts as a locksmith, honed over decades of analyzing the smallest details, refused to let him ignore the discrepancies in what he'd been told. He replayed the events in his mind: the dispatcher's call, the bruises on Mary's body, the vague responses from the deputies. None of it fit together. The hit and run was the catalyst, but the injuries suggested something more deliberate, something more personal. Fred thought back to the past few weeks. Mary had mentioned feeling uneasy, as if someone had been watching her. She had even brought up the possibility of installing a security system in the house. At the time, Fred had dismissed it as paranoia, reassuring her that everything was fine. Now, that decision haunted him. Pulling out his phone, Fred began to search for information about recent crimes in the area. He found reports of suspicious activity near the intersection where the accident occurred: break-ins, prowlers, and even an attempted assault. A chill ran down his spine as a pattern began to emerge. Determined to get answers, Fred decided to contact the deputies again. If they wouldn't give him the full picture, he'd have to push for it. But as he looked at Mary, still unconscious and vulnerable, he made another promise to himself: he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Someone had hurt her, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. Fred's resolve hardened as he checked on his children. Emily was asleep, her fractured arm wrapped in a cast. Jason, bruised but resilient, clung to a stuffed dinosaur, his face peaceful in sleep. Seeing them like this, so fragile yet so brave, stirred something fierce in Fred. Returning to Mary's room, he sat by her side, his hands trembling as he held hers. The bruises on her arms and the mark on her neck weren't just injuries, they were clues, pieces of a puzzle he needed to solve. He wasn't just a locksmith tonight, he was a husband, a father, and a man on a mission. Fred called the deputies. This time his tone was unyielding. "I need to know everything," he demanded. "I think someone hurt my wife before the accident. Check her injuries, the footage, anything." The officer on the line hesitated but finally agreed to follow up. Fred felt a surge of hope. As dawn broke, Fred kissed Mary's hand and whispered, "I won't stop until I find out what happened. I promise." He glanced at his children through the small hospital window and knew one thing for certain: whoever had done this to his family would face the full force of his determination. Fred Thomas wasn't just a locksmith anymore, he was a man fighting to unlock the truth, no matter how dangerous the journey might be. By midday, Fred was pacing the hospital corridors when his phone rang. It was one of the deputies. "Mr. Thomas, we've reviewed the surveillance footage and spoken to some witnesses," the officer said, his voice measured. "There's something you need to see." Fred's stomach churned as he drove to the station. The footage, grainy but clear enough, showed Mary's car at the intersection. It captured the black SUV barreling toward her vehicle at an alarming speed, but then something made Fred's blood run cold. The driver of the SUV hadn't just been reckless. In the moments before the crash, the vehicle swerved deliberately, almost targeting Mary's car. It wasn't random. It was calculated. Fred's heart pounded as he watched the footage loop. He noticed something else: a second figure. A person was seen briefly near the intersection, walking hurriedly away from the scene just before the crash. The deputies confirmed they were trying to identify this individual. "That's not all," the deputy added. "We've examined the area and found broken glass near the intersection, a bottle of what appears to be chloroform. We're running tests to determine if it was used." Fred's knees felt weak. Chloroform? The bruises, the neck marks, it all pointed to one horrific possibility. Someone had tried to subdue Mary, possibly force her into the SUV. The crash may have been a desperate attempt to cover up what had already been set in motion. Fred gripped the edge of the desk, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Find them," he said through gritted teeth. "Whoever did this, find them." The next few days were a blur of investigations and medical updates. Mary remained unconscious, but her vital signs were improving. Fred stayed by her side, whispering words of love and encouragement. He kept his children close, shielding them from the darker truths of what had happened. The deputies finally delivered a breakthrough. The driver of the SUV had been identified, a man with a history of violent offenses. When they brought him in for questioning, his story unraveled. He admitted to targeting Mary on orders from someone else, though he claimed not to know why. Fred's blood boiled at the revelation. Someone had orchestrated this nightmare, and the driver was just a pawn. The deputies assured Fred they were pursuing every lead, but Fred wasn't satisfied. He began his own investigation, piecing together connections and uncovering unsettling details about people Mary had encountered recently. As weeks turned into months, Mary began to recover. When she finally woke, Fred was there, tears streaming down his face as he kissed her hand. "I told you I wouldn't leave you," he whispered. Though the road ahead was long, Fred vowed to protect his family with everything he had. The ordeal had unlocked a new side of him, a relentless drive for justice and truth. As the screen fades to black, Fred's voice echoes to anyone out there: never stop fighting for the ones you love. Never let fear silence you. Thanks for watching, everyone. If this story moved you, please like, share, and comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories like this one. Stay safe and take care of the people you love.